Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, so get this. Latin America in the 1960s.
Oh, yeah.
Total upheaval.
Yeah.
Authoritarian regimes, crazy economic inequality.
Right.
And to top it all off, the Cold War is like throwing gasoline on the fire.
Really mixing things up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what happens?
What happens?
Young people are like, nope, we're done with this.
Yeah.
And they kick off all these rebellions that totally shake the continent.
Wow.
We're going to deep dive into why and how these youth movements just exploded, what impact they had.
Ah.
And we've got some seriously cool sources to help us out here.
Like what?
We've got a clip from the Mr. Hutchings History podcast.
Oh, cool. I like that one.
Yeah, it's great. And then we're going to dig into case studies from Chile, Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina.
Sounds fascinating.
It really is.
It's amazing how these rebellions weren't just like some isolated teenage angst, you know?
Right.
It was way deeper than that.
Totally.
They were tied to this whole global shift that was happening. Think social justice movements and like a growing distrust of authority.
Okay, so picture this. It's the 1960s. Latin America is basically a pressure cooker.
Oh, yeah.
You've got authoritarian regimes clinging to power. Social injustice is everywhere.
Yeah.
And figures like Che Guevara are inspiring these revolutionary dreams.
Right.
It's no wonder that young people were ready to erupt.
Yeah, they had to. I mean, historians look at this in different ways.
Okay.
You've got Marxist historians who point to class oppression and anti-imperialist feelings. They see these rebellions as a pushback against the economic system, which they see as rigged for the elite.
Okay. But it wasn't all about economics.
Right.
I mean, these young people wanted a fairer society. Yeah. They wanted a voice and the basic rights and freedoms that had been taken from them for so long.
Absolutely. That's where Chile in the late 1960s comes in.
Okay.
What began as student protests for better conditions at universities.
Yeah.
Things like more resources, more autonomy, a fairer education system. It quickly became something so much bigger.
This is where it gets really interesting. These Chilean student protests of 67 and 68,
Right.
they weren't just about textbooks and classrooms anymore.
Exactly.
It became this huge critique of Chilean society as a whole.
And, you know, one of the most powerful things to come out of that movement was the manifesto of the Chilean Student Federation.
Oh, yeah.
That line, education is not a privilege, it is a right for all.
Wow.
It really sums up their fight.
I get chills just hearing that.
Yeah.
It's amazing how that statement resonated way beyond just wanting better schools.
Right.
It became this rallying cry for social change in Chile and even beyond. I mean, that message is still so relevant today, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And if you connect that to the bigger picture,
Okay.
these protests in Chile were almost like a preview of the huge social and political changes that would sweep through the country.
Yeah.
They may not have seen immediate change, but they definitely planted the seeds for future reforms.
Now let's move on to Mexico in 1968,
Okay.
a year that took a much darker turn, culminating in the tragic Tlatelolco Massacre.
Right.
But before we get to that,
Yeah.
it's important to understand what those students were actually fighting for.
It's crucial to understand that Mexican students, just like their counterparts in Chile, they were driven by a desire for democratic freedoms and an end to police brutality.
They wanted basic rights.
Yeah. They were up against a really oppressive regime.
Yeah.
And they were inspired by that global wave of youth activism.
Okay, so Tlatelolco,
Yeah.
this event is like burned into Mexico's collective memory.
I can imagine.
It's October 2nd, 1968, just 10 days before the Mexico City Olympics.
Wow.
And a peaceful student rally in Tlatelolco Square is suddenly met with military gunfire.
Oh, wow.
Can you imagine that?
I can't.
The Mexican government, under President Gustavo Díaz Ordaz,
Right.
they decided to crush the movement with brutal force.
Oh, wow.
The official death toll was shockingly low.
Really?
Something like 30 people.
Wow.
But independent investigations and survivor accounts, they point to hundreds, possibly even thousands killed.
That's horrible.
The Tlatelolco Massacre sent shockwaves through Mexico and the entire world.
Yeah.
It's a terrifying reminder of what lengths authoritarian regimes will go to silence dissent.
Right.
Decades later, the memory of Tlatelolco still haunts Mexico.
It makes you wonder how a government can justify such a blatant disregard for human life.
Yeah.
It really underscores the dangers of unchecked power
Right.
and the absolute importance of protecting democratic freedoms.
This is why primary source material is so important.
I agree.
Things like survivor testimonies, declassified government documents, they give us invaluable insight into events like the Tlatelolco Massacre.
Right.
They help us piece together what really happened and make sure these stories are never forgotten.
Absolutely. Those firsthand accounts give you a depth of understanding that you wouldn't get from just official reports.
Right.
They really humanize history and remind us that these were real people whose lives were tragically impacted.
All right, let's head south to Brazil.
Okay.
Here, the story of youth rebellion take on a bit of a different flavor.
Oh, yeah.
You had student protests, initially focused on university issues, but then they transformed into this much broader resistance movement against the military dictatorship that seized power in 1964.
It's really important to understand the context there.
Yeah.
The 1964 coup ushered in this period of intense political repression.
Oh, wow.
Freedoms were limited, censorship was everywhere, and anyone who spoke out against the regime faced serious consequences.
But even with all that fear, young Brazilians found ways to resist. Groups like the National Union of Students, or UNE.
Okay.
They became these powerful symbols of defiance.
Interesting.
They organized protests against censorship, economic inequality, and the growing influence of foreign powers.
Like who?
Particularly the United States.
The UNE was vital in channeling the discontent that so many Brazilians felt.
Right.
They organized marches, demonstrations, strikes, constantly reminding the dictatorship that their power wasn't absolute.
But the regime wasn't going to let that slide, were they?
I doubt it.
They cracked down hard on these protests.
How so?
They used arrest, torture, even exile to silence people.
Wow. The Brazilian military dictatorship was ruthless in suppressing any opposition.
Yeah.
They saw the student movement as a direct threat.
Right.
And they were determined to crush it.
It's incredible how those young people kept fighting for what they believed in.
I know.
Despite the very real danger.
Yeah, their courage is inspiring. It highlights a crucial aspect of resistance, though.
What's
It's
that?
the power of collective action.
Okay.
Even when things seem impossible, people coming together can make a difference.
Right.
They can challenge authority, raise awareness, and inspire others to join their cause.
Now let's shift gears over to Argentina.
All right.
Here, the story of youth rebellion is quite different.
How so?
While students in Chile, Mexico, and Brazil were taking to the streets, their Argentine counterparts were dealing with a much more oppressive environment.
Yeah, the military regimes that dominated Argentina in the 60s and 70s,
Right?
they were incredibly repressive.
Yeah.
They controlled the universities, clamped down on free speech, and used brutal tactics to silence any dissent.
So while in other parts of Latin America, student protests were this visible force for change.
Right.
In Argentina, the struggle was largely forced underground.
That makes sense.
What accounts for that difference, though?
Yeah.
Were Argentine students just less rebellious?
That's where things get interesting. Historians from the Structuralist school,
Okay.
they have this thought-provoking perspective.
What is it?
They argue that Argentina's unique economic and political structures,
Okay.
they made it much harder for large-scale protests to happen.
Could you unpack that a bit?
Sure.
What exactly is the structuralist school of thought?
Okay.
And how does it apply to Argentina?
The structuralist view argues that the way a country's economy and government are set up can either help or hinder protests. In Argentina's case,
Yeah.
they believe the system with its economic dependence, state control, and a pervasive climate of fear,
Yeah.
it made it almost impossible for large-scale movements to take root.
So it wasn't just about the level of repression.
Right.
It was about the underlying systems that shaped Argentine society.
Exactly.
That's fascinating.
It shows how these factors are interconnected when it comes to either fostering or stifling social movements.
This is what makes studying history so captivating.
Totally.
There are always these multiple layers to peel back different perspectives to consider.
Yeah.
And it's never as simple as it seems on the surface.
Precisely. And by digging into these complexities, we get a richer understanding of the past.
Right.
It helps us appreciate the challenges and triumphs of those who fought for change
Yeah.
and the lasting impact of their struggles.
We've covered a lot in this first part of our deep dive.
Yeah.
From the vibrant student movements in Chile and Mexico
Right.
to the more subdued, but no less significant struggles in Brazil and Argentina.
Yeah.
It seems like young people across the continent, despite facing different obstacles and using different approaches,
Right.
were united by this powerful desire for a more just and equitable world.
Absolutely. And while we've seen how these movements challenged authoritarian regimes and demanded social justice, they also faced brutal repression.
Right.
These stories are a testament to the power of courage, the resilience of the human spirit, and the unwavering belief in the possibility of change.
Welcome back to our deep dive into youth rebellion in 1960s Latin America.
Yeah.
We've already journeyed through Chile, Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina.
We have.
And it's been mind-blowing to see how different all these movements were, the different causes they championed, the tactics they used, and the incredible obstacles they faced.
I think it's amazing that despite often facing really brutal repression, these movements left a permanent mark. They didn't just fade away. They planted the seeds for big social and political changes later on.
So let's talk legacy.
Okay.
What lasting impacts do these youth rebellions have?
Yeah.
Did they actually lead to any real change?
That's a tough question.
Yeah.
But I think it's safe to say they had a profound impact.
Okay.
Even if it wasn't immediately obvious. For one thing, these movements chipped away at the legitimacy of those authoritarian regimes.
Interesting.
Yeah, they exposed their weaknesses and eroded public trust.
So there were little cracks in the foundation.
Yeah, exactly.
Even if they couldn't bring the whole structure down right away.
Right, and their impact went beyond just challenging those in power.
Okay.
They also inspired future generations of activists and reformers.
The courage and idealism of those involved served as a beacon of hope for those who came after.
It's like they lit a torch that was passed down through the years, and it continues to light the way towards a more just and democratic society.
That's powerful stuff.
It really is. And we can't forget the international impact.
Oh, yeah. Tell me about that.
These movements brought the world's attention to the struggles for democracy and human rights in Latin America.
Right.
They sparked solidarity movements all over the world, putting pressure on oppressive regimes and amplifying the voices of those demanding change.
I hadn't thought about it that way before.
Yeah.
It's amazing to think about how these movements had this ripple effect.
Right.
How they crossed borders and inspired people across the globe to fight for social justice. It reminds us that we're all connected.
Yeah.
That injustice anywhere threatens justice everywhere.
Absolutely. And speaking of keeping these stories alive, primary source materials are crucial here.
Give me some examples.
Things like the Manifesto of the National Union of Students in Brazil, or survivor accounts from the Tlatelolco Massacre.
Right.
They provide invaluable insights into the motivations, experiences, and aspirations of those who participated in these movements.
It's like we can time travel and get a glimpse into the past through their words and perspectives. It's really powerful to connect with history in such a personal way.
It's a responsibility, too.
Okay.
We have a duty to make sure that these stories are preserved and shared and learned from.
Yeah.
They offer valuable lessons about courage, resilience, and the power of people coming together in the face of injustice.
It's important to acknowledge the diversity of experiences within these movements.
Right, absolutely.
It wasn't just one big homogenous group of young people all thinking and acting the same way.
Yeah, there were different factions, different ideologies, different levels of engagement.
It's important to recognize this diversity and not oversimplify these complex historical movements.
And it's also important to remember that these movements didn't always succeed right away.
Right.
Some were brutally crushed.
Yeah.
Their leaders imprisoned or exiled.
It's a reminder that the fight for justice is often long and difficult.
It is.
And setbacks are going to happen.
But even when they were defeated, these movements planted seeds of resistance that continued to grow in the years that followed. Their ideas, their courage, their belief in a better world, they continued to inspire and motivate those who came after them.
It makes you realize that history isn't a straight line.
Exactly.
It's more like a tapestry with all these threads of progress and setbacks, victories and defeats.
And that the fight for justice is like a relay race, with each generation passing the baton to the next.
As we think about the legacies of these movements, it's also crucial to acknowledge that the struggle for social justice in Latin America and beyond is still going on.
The fight for equality, democracy, human rights, it's far from over.
It really makes you think.
It does.
What are the lessons we can take away from these movements? How can we apply those lessons to the challenges we face today?
That's the big question, isn't it?
It is.
One of the biggest lessons, I think, is the power of collective action.
Okay.
These movements proved that ordinary people when they're united for a common purpose, can challenge even the most powerful systems.
It's a good reminder that we're not powerless,
right?
That our voices matter, and that by working together, we can actually make a difference.
Another important takeaway is persistence.
Okay.
These movements faced incredible obstacles.
They did.
But they never gave up hope.
Right.
They kept fighting even when things looked impossible.
That's a powerful thought.
It is. It reminds us that change takes time.
Yeah.
That it requires dedication, resilience, and a willingness to keep pushing forward even when things are tough.
And let's not forget to learn from history.
Oh, absolutely.
By studying these movements, by understanding their successes and failures, we can learn valuable insights into how to effectively challenge injustice in our own time.
It's like we're standing on the shoulders of giants, learning from their experiences and drawing inspiration from their courage.
Their struggles can teach us and help us navigate the complexities of social change and find new ways to create a more just and equitable world.
Absolutely. These movements weren't just historical events. They were examples of courage, resilience, and hope. And by remembering their stories, by honoring their legacies, we can keep their spirit alive and continue the fight for a better future.
Welcome back to our deep dive into 1960s Latin America. We've covered so much. The motivations, the movements, the victories and the tragedies that really defined this era of youth rebellion.
It's been quite a journey.
It really has. It shows how history isn't just about, like, dates and names in a textbook. It's about real people, you know? Fighting for a better world.
Absolutely.
And that brings us to you, dear listener. We've unpacked a lot about these movements. But what's really stuck with you? What parallels do you see between these 1960s rebellions and youth activism today? Think about it. The fight for social justice. Economic equality, environmental protection.
It crosses generations.
These are issues that resonate across generations.
Young people are still pushing for change, using new tools and platforms, but they still face similar challenges. You've still got those in power. Apathy, even hostility.
It's wild to think about how much the world has changed since the 1960s.
I know.
And yet some of these core struggles are the same. The fight for a more just and equitable world, it never really ends, does it?
It's an ongoing process.
It's like a relay race that each generation runs in.
And those 1960s movements, they're still so relevant today.
How so?
They remind us that even when things seem impossible, collective action can work.
It shows us that history isn't just some old dusty thing. It's happening right now.
All around us.
And we all have a part to play in shaping what comes next.
So keep exploring this topic. We've only scratched the surface here.
Dive
into those primary sources we mentioned. The Manifesto of the National Union of Students in Brazil, the works of historians like Eric Zolov and Alan Knight. Let those voices from the past inform your understanding of the present and inspire your actions for the future.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Absolutely.
Till next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and never stop questioning the world around you.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.